Hello, I'm Matt Reardon, and thanks for watching this Wednesday evening West weather update, March 8th, brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. There has been talk, certainly if you haven't seen it on the news, we'll talk about it here, of the approaching atmospheric river, or warm atmospheric river event closing in on California here Thursday and Friday, really over the next 72 hours. Before we get into that forecast, we'll certainly break that down. We'll talk about that. I wanted to cover this map here. This is just the last 14 days of snowfall across the West region. And I'm showing that because I think it's important for that conversation about this atmospheric river event moving forward into this weekend. We've seen multiple feet of snow in portions of the Sierra Nevada and California. We saw very uncommon snow through Southern California at relatively low elevations there, maybe 1,000 feet to 1,500 feet. Northern California saw a lot of snow from this as well. This is an area that's going to be impacted with some flooding concerns, with rainfall and additional snowfall as we move, again, over the next 2 or 3 days here. So I wanted to touch on that quickly. If you look at the rainfall map, just to give you an idea of how much water has fallen, again, this map looking over the last 14 days. Liquid equivalent falling certainly in the upper elevations of the Sierra Nevada, but we saw 3 to 4 inches of rainfall through parts of the Central Valley of California, and certainly quite a bit more in some of these coastal areas. And that has left the soils in California specifically fairly saturated. This is looking at NASA estimated soil moisture through the root zone, and you can see higher values across California. So we're adding more water this weekend, and we'll get into the details of that, over an area which has already had quite a bit of water, either in the form of ice, right, snowfall in the mountains, or rainfall at their lower elevations in the valley. Something to kind of set the stage for this event here, to get into the particulars of it as we move forward. If we look at this chart here, this is looking at California snow water content relative to normal. And what I mean by that is this blue line here is this winter here, 2022 through 2023. You can see it accruing throughout this very busy, record-setting winter we've had across the West here, certainly in California, in the north, central, south. And if we aggregate the state total here on this fourth and final graph, you can see this blue line is creeping up on our maximum snow water content year, all the way back in 1982 and 1983. This red line here, which you can see peaks in about April to May. So we'll see where we are at that point if we're knocking on the door for a record snowpack year, but we're certainly on trend for that right now. Our typical peak, or the typical year, is this light blue line, this light blue curve here, which peaks in late March or early April. And we're well beyond that. This is those maps I've been showing you where we're 200% above normal for our snow water equivalent, at least at this time here in early March. So it's been a busy year, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what exactly we're looking for in terms of impacts, we're expecting more here over the next 72 hours and potentially even beyond that. We'll talk about the week to 2 week time frame as well in this video. There's a lot to cover here. Quickly touching on some rainfall events through the year. This is Fresno, California. I want to touch on the valley a bit. We've been talking about the Sierra Nevadas, the Southern California mountain ranges, and the coastal ranges. But the valley has seen a lot of rainfall, not necessarily snowfall beyond maybe a few observations here and there. But this is looking at the average rainfall through Fresno through a typical year. That's that black curve here. Last year, 2022, observed rainfall is this kind of hard to see dotted gray line all the way down here, reflecting that drought we saw in 2021 and 2022. Well, this year is in blue here. You can see we're running well above average in Fresno in terms of rainfall. It's actually bumping into our legend here. It's almost going off the graph. If we jump up and we look at Sacramento, California, same story. There's that dotted line, 2022, all the way down here. Again, reflecting that multi-year drought that we've been dealing with out west. This year, big change. We're seeing higher values. Jump over to the coastline, San Francisco, same story. Just a lot of rain falling in California as we've gone through 2023. Look at the radar map right now across the country. Light snow showers moving through really the Lake Tahoe area, central and northern Sierra Nevada. Maybe some showers moving through Sacramento just a few hours ago, but it's starting to lighten up a bit as we now start to watch the next event move in, and we'll get into that here in just the next few slides here. If we look at the all hazards map from NOAA, valid as of this afternoon, here on Wednesday afternoon, see flood watches have now been issued for essentially all of central and parts of northern California. Winter storm watches and warnings out for the Sierra Nevadas as well. Winter storm warnings in blue, watches I should say in blue here for parts of southern Oregon. I'm expecting over the next 24 hours this map to get quite a bit busier as we convert some of these watches into warnings, either for flood or for winter storm warnings as this event approaches in earnest, really Thursday night. We talked about in the last video the Madden-Julian Oscillation, how when it starts here in the Western Pacific, where it was on March 5th or March 3rd, in transition or crosses through the Pacific Ocean into the Eastern Pacific, and then all the way over here into the Western Hemisphere through mid-March, all else equal, that tends to promote extensions of the Pacific jet stream. And when we extend the Pacific jet stream, we increase the chance for these atmospheric river type events. We saw the same phenomenon occur in January with that atmospheric river sequence that we saw, which brought our fast start to the water year that we've talked about so much already. And if I take you over and we look at that jet stream, starting here, I'll take it back all the way to Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday evening, we can see that extension starting to occur. We start all the way down here, far southern Japan. We have this extension through Hawaii, or just the northern tip of Hawaii here. As I take this out from Wednesday to Thursday and Friday, and I'll step through this here through Wednesday evening, going through the day on Thursday, and overnight into the early hours of Friday morning, you can see we've extended this jet stream essentially from Taiwan all the way through California, which is just north of this H here, that high pressure, all the way to California. There's your Pineapple Express. Hawaii, draw a line in the jet stream from there to California. That's the Pineapple Express. That's that atmospheric river event that we were concerned about last week, coming to fruition now here on March 10th. And really, here we are on Wednesday night. This event has already begun in terms of that Pacific water vapor. And what I mean by that, we're looking at total precipitable water in the Pacific, essentially just a total measure of water in the atmosphere, which could be rained out. And you'll notice these values are higher down by the equator, down in those tropics where we have that warm, moist tropical air. But the extension of that Pacific jet stream can draw up that warm, moist tropical air and bring it up into the mid-latitudes where we live and into California and into the high mountain ranges, where orographic lift or lift along those mountains helps to wring out all that Pacific moisture. And you can see this beginning to occur just east of Hawaii. This low pressure system here, north of Hawaii, pulling up these higher values of atmospheric water content, which over the next 48 hours are going to quite literally be yanked and moved through the eastern Pacific, focusing themselves right along the central California coastline. And I'll just give you an example of this. What you're looking at here is a map or a measure on this map of that transport of that water vapor. And I'm starting in here on Wednesday afternoon. You can see that transport out in the eastern Pacific as I step this through 12-hour increments. Overnight Wednesday night, you can see it picking up well off the west coast of California. As we get into early Thursday, you can see this now approaching the state. Let's go through the day on Thursday to the point where Thursday night the event has really arrived. This is looking at Thursday evening, right before dinner time, and we can see this extension of the jet pulling up that water vapor. And really this event has begun in earnest by that Thursday PM time frame. I'll walk this through the next 6 hours here, overnight on Thursday into Friday, really the peak of this event here until eventually, as we get into the day on Saturday, early Saturday, into Sunday, we start to wane down and reduce some of that moisture transport, and the precipitation and the snowfall will begin to weaken at that point as well. We can actually look at that same kind of loop, that same time series we just looked at in a different way. This is looking at that time series map out through time on a forecast here. And we can see that water vapor transport maximized over central California up here on the right, really in that Thursday night to early Friday time frame, right along this kind of March 10th. That's the beginning of Friday right there. So Thursday night into Friday is when we're maximizing that water vapor transport right over central California, which is when the heaviest rain and wind and potentially snow in those high upper elevations will be at their hardest. Depending on where exactly you are in the state, the impacts and the timing of that will differ slightly hour to hour. Over on the right, you'll notice there's actually a measure for how strong this atmospheric river event is historically. And that's over here. So we're looking at a potentially moderate to strong atmospheric river event. And I will say there's been a lot of strong narrative associated with this event. I've seen news stories about catastrophic flooding, things of that nature. This is expected to be a big, impactful event. Right now, we're not expecting something like an extreme or a catastrophic flooding event. That's not to say there won't be impacts in terms of mudslides, particularly in Northern California. We have saturated soils. That could be an issue along the coastline, essentially all the way through the central coastline of California, maybe even to parts of central Southern California on the coast. We're expecting mudslide risk. Winds won't be quite as big of a story with this event. We saw some events earlier in the year where winds were almost the main story. We are expecting 30 to 50 mile an hour winds from this, wind gusts. That's enough to cause some local issues, but nothing widespread like some of those earlier events. This event, it'll really be the water and some of the flooding, particularly related to that snowpack conversation we were having at the beginning of this video. And I'll try to give you a sense for what I'm talking about here. If we take this back to Wednesday evening, where we are right now recording this video, this is looking at a map of temperature anomalies aloft in the atmosphere, about 5,000 feet up, 850 millibars. That's about halfway up the Sierra Nevada crest. You notice that right now we're cold. In fact, we've been cold on the surface and about 5,000 feet up for much of the 2023 winter here. That's kept temperatures down. But as this atmospheric river event moves in on Thursday and into early Friday, watch these temperatures change. You can almost see them associated with that atmospheric river start to warm up to the point where Friday morning, now we're well above freezing at 5,000 feet and then raining at that same level. You can see those warm temperatures here moving in along that axis of that heavy water vapor Thursday night into Friday. This is why we're calling this, or you might have seen this event dubbed a warm atmospheric river event, because we're expecting warmer temperatures. Those snow levels are rising up 5,000 feet, maybe even beyond that in certain locations. And we're taking that rainfall, that warmer rainfall, and that's precipitating onto those snowpack that we just built up over the last 14 days, at least below 5,000 feet. That increases the flooding concern because we're melting some of that snowpack, which is as much as 1 to 2 feet, if I can get that out. If you melt that, we're talking 1 to 2 inches potentially of liquid equivalent there, maybe a little bit more. You're adding that on top of what already might be 4 to 6 inches of rainfall. That's a large rainfall event and potentially a small area with tributaries and streams running down out of the foothills in the Sierra Nevada and some of these coastal mountain ranges. That's increasing that flooding concern as we go through Thursday into Friday. That's where some of that language being a bit stronger in terms of serious flooding impacts. We're still not expecting extreme widespread flooding impacts to the valley or to municipalities. Urban flooding will remain a concern, especially in local areas, and we certainly advise you to heed the warnings and advisories from local authorities in terms of specific local flooding impacts. But I did want to moderate the discussion a bit because there's been some crazy articles out recently about catastrophic flooding. We're just not there yet in terms of this event. As far as what this actually looks like, again, taking back to Wednesday evening here, looking at the ECMWF, this is their forecast out over the next 3 days to give you some sense of timing when this event will pick up. There's those small showers we saw moving through Central Valley of California and some snow showers moving through central Sierra Nevadas and the northern Sierra Nevadas, the Lake Tahoe area. So we go through the night, Wednesday night, rather clear, through Thursday, rather clear, but by Thursday p.m., talking 4 p.m. Thursday, the rain showers have begun, at least lightly, across northern California, potentially snow showers moving into the upper elevations, the coastal mountain ranges, the Klamath Mountains, the Sierra Nevadas. But you'll notice, even from this image, or as I take this through Thursday night into Friday, those snow levels not as widespread as we saw from some of these previous events. In fact, they're way up now on some of the highest elevations of the Sierra Nevada or the Klamath Mountain. The bigger story here is rainfall. All the rainfall expected to fall in the coastal areas of California, 4 to 6 inches potentially. Some of the coastal areas on the central coastline outside San Francisco, 4 to 6 inches potentially in the foothills east of Fresno, in the far eastern part of the Central Sierra, or the far eastern part of the Central Valley, As we get into the Central Valley proper, far western municipalities here, we're talking maybe a ½ inch to 1 inch. As we move east, those values will increase. Fresno, Merced, Madera, we're talking 2 to 3 inches, locally potentially higher than that. So a lot of rainfall moving into the Central Valley of California as well. More snowfall coming up to the interior parts of Oregon, Washington, Idaho. Not a huge event, but we could be talking about an additional foot of snowfall for areas where we're trying to build up snowpack. We've been talking about that story for it feels like the last few months, certainly. And this is going through the day on Friday. Now we're into Friday evening. Rain still falling in central part of California. The event is starting to shift south across the state. You see Southern California, Los Angeles potentially getting rainfall, ½ inch to 1 inch out of this. More rainfall falling in the upper elevations, potentially right along the coastline and those coastal foothills. But really through Saturday into Sunday, we start to weaken and leave the event toward the middle part of the United States and the continent there. Now, we do have some lingering showers, I should say, sticking around at least on this model run through Sunday, but this won't be heavy rainfall by any means or heavy snowfall up in the Sierra Nevadas. We get something of a break here before what potentially is looking like yet another atmospheric river event early next week, Monday into Tuesday. We'll talk about those impacts from this event a bit later in this video. I still want to focus on that first one coming through Thursday into Friday. This is the Weather Prediction Center. This is their excessive rainfall outlook for day 2. So that's Thursday in through Friday morning. They have a wide swath of this moderate risk area for excessive rainfall out for central California, both the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and the coastal portions of central California. If we look at the rainfall totals over the next 3 days, this is through Saturday, see high liquid equivalent amounts falling in the central Sierra Nevadas through the Central Valley. Again, we talked about how the western cities along the Central Valley could be seeing about a half to 1 inch of rainfall. That increases as you move east to the point where Sacramento, Fresno, Merced, south of there, Visalia, we could be talking 2 to 3 inches, potentially more locally, and some potentially even higher amounts than that along the coastal portions of California on the central and south central coastline. Over there, I'm more concerned about mudslides, potential local flooding impacts in streams, certainly through some of the foothills. Mudslide risk might be maximized in Northern California. I will say one more kind of localized risk associated with this, certainly with the snowpack that we've seen over the last 14 days or even the last 2 months, is roof collapses. So we have snowpack, which is already heavy, sitting on these roofs, rainfall coming on top of that, and some of the upper elevations of Sierra Nevadas, we're talking about some houses up there. That snow will absorb that rain, and it could double in weight. And so we are concerned about roof collapses, and that some local authorities are actually encouraging folks to clear their roofs of snowfall if they can ahead of this storm. Now, it's easier said than done, but unfortunately, just because of the coincidence of having that recent snowpack, really kind of that 2,000 to 5,000 foot range there in the Sierra Nevadas or through the northern kind of California mountain ranges, we are concerned about roof collapses as kind of a localized, specific flooding threat. If we even want to call that a flood threat, it's kind of a combination of snow and flooding. As far as snow from this event, again, we talked about how wind not being the main event here, snow not necessarily the main event either. The upper elevations of Sierra Nevada certainly expecting additional feet of snowfall out of this, as they would with almost any atmospheric river event moving through California. But the water in terms of rainfall impacts in those foothills, the streams, the tributaries of the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers, I think will be the bigger story, and then certainly along the coastline and some of the metro areas over there. That'll be the bigger story, but we are getting more snow out of this. At this point, I'm not even sure we need it, but I suppose long-term we will take a buildup of that snowpack if you can. Idaho, Oregon, Washington, we talked about wanting a little bit more snow in here to build up the snowpack that we were missing in terms of that average or normal amount. This will help, but not quite as significant of an event as maybe we could have gotten. But again, it can't hurt adding another 6 inches to potentially a foot of snow, depending on which state exactly you're in. Now, I showed this graphic earlier quantifying this atmospheric river event that's coming through March 9th and 10th, waning on the 11th through the weekend here. You'll notice this maximum over here on the 13th and 14th, Monday into Tuesday. We walked you through that ECMWF forecast. That was that next event potentially coming through here. We're keeping an eye on this one. Not expected right now in the forecast to be quite as strong as the one we're dealing with here over the next 48 hours. But coming on the heels of a big event that just dropped a lot of water, the impacts could still be high. And there's time, given it's 5 to 6 days out, that this event, as that forecast gets a bit closer, could look a bit stronger. It could look a bit weaker as well. The confidence is just a little lower when you're talking to 5 to 6 days out. That signal is there. It's pretty consistent that we'll be seeing at least another system move through in that kind of Monday to Tuesday timeframe. Naturally, if we're talking about an extended or an atmospheric river event, we're going to want to look at the jet stream. I'll take you back to Wednesday evening, where we're at now, recording this video. If I walk you through this Thursday into Friday, you'll see that first event moving through California on the west coast there. It's the event we just spent the last few slides talking about. We get that break on Saturday into Sunday, but by Monday you'll notice a re-extension of that Pacific jet, or a reconnection as we go through that Pacific subtropical extension of the jet up north over Hawaii, trough just off the coast of California. And we've extended the jet again, albeit a bit more wavier, a bit more amplified of a pattern, which I think could help disconnect that moisture transport a bit in terms of this specific event moving into California. And you'll just notice it's not quite that same Pineapple Express event we saw in that Thursday to Friday forecast, in the sense that I can't really draw a line in the jet stream from California to Hawaii at this point. It's more broken up or amplified or wavy than the one we saw on the 9th and the 10th. Take a look over here at the precipitable water. We looked at an observed or a satellite estimated view of this earlier, that buildup just east of Hawaii. This is looking at the forecast for Tuesday, March 14th out into next week. And you'll see a strong plume just west of Hawaii here, associated with a low pressure system there. And then the secondary plume with that re-extension of the Pacific jet, not quite as strong, again, as what we were expecting here on the 9th and 10th over the next 48 hours. So we are expecting another event early next week. We're hoping right now that's not quite as magnified or not quite the same event in terms of precipitation and water falling in California in some of these areas that are vulnerable because, again, that snowpack exists there and those saturated soils exist. Doubling back, looking at the MJO, we are in this transitional phase. We're going through phase 7, phase 8 into phase 1 through the Pacific Ocean. You can see the Western Pacific here, through the Eastern Pacific, from phase 7 through phase 8, back into phase 1, over that March 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, all the way into next week, 18th to the 20th time frame. Throughout this whole event here, I'm concerned about re-extensions of that Pacific jet or sequential atmospheric river type events. If I walk you all the way back to this time series, again, this forecast from the global, the GFS, the ensemble here, see the big event 9th and 10th, we see another event here, but this heightened kind of risk for atmospheric river events from March 17th onward, or maybe even the 7 days after March 18th, talking about that third week of March. Now, we're too far out to look at details here. The operational run has perhaps another event coming through March 19th to March 20th. Far too early to talk about details like that, but the risk because of that MJO transition is there. I think that exists through that third week of March, potentially waning as we get into the fourth week or that April time frame. We already looked at the jet stream. If I take you back and look at the GFS ensemble, again, their jet stream forecast for March 18th, right, that time in question where I talked about that risk sticking around for sequential atmospheric river events. It's harder to see because these signals get washed out a bit in terms of the ensemble, especially all the way out here at 240 hours in the forecast or 10 days out on March 18th here. But you can see something of a reflection or a hint that we may be re-extending that Pacific jet stream. You can kind of draw a line from Kauai up through to California here, signifying the risk for yet another Pineapple Express event. This is something we're keeping an eye on. The confidence is low on this for now. The risk is there, and the impacts from this event coming on the heels of potentially two atmospheric river events in the forecast now for March 9th and 10th, and March 13th and 14th, the impacts just increase as a result of more water and more snow falling on the same location over and over and over again. So it is a concern in that regard. If we were going to get up to some of those extreme or catastrophic flooding type scenarios, we would need a number of these events falling over a short period of time. We're not seeing that in the forecast right now. The confidence isn't high to use language like that, but it is in the back of my mind in terms of a risk that we'll keep an eye on over the next 2 to 3 weeks. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center, their forecast for next week in terms of precipitation, we talked about yet another event coming through on the 13th and the 14th. They've highlighted Central and Southern California, higher probability of above average precipitation. That's not a big surprise. We have some high confidence that we will be seeing another event come through on the 13th and 14th, albeit hopefully not quite as strong as what's expected here over the next 48 hours. If we look at the 8 to 14 day precipitation forecast, same map, just looking at March 16th through the 22nd, heightened risk for rainfall above average in California and actually the southwestern part of the United States, but not a bona fide signal. If you remember, when we looked at this map for this current event, the values were quite a bit higher for Central California. So the confidence on an extended kind of risk of a sequential atmospheric river event through the end of March is lower. The risk is there. It's just a bit lower, and our confidence isn't as high right now as we could be, given some other mitigating factors. I haven't talked about temperatures throughout this video. We did talk about how it was a warm atmospheric river event. That will keep frost and freeze risk to a minimum, certainly over the next 10 days as these two systems come through. I will say, while the freeze and the frost risk isn't in the news right now, we are expecting to be cooler, and that's just really a function of there's going to be a lot of rain and a lot of clouds associated with these events. We keep the sun out, we keep temperatures down, at least to a small degree, and it's been a very cold start to the year. If I pulled up, and I just might as well just pull it up here, looking at the last 30 to 60 days of temperature across the West and how those deviate from average, we've been cold across the West, and this is cutting into pollination hours across the Central Valley of California. These orchards often need to be pollinated. Bees won't come out or won't pollinate. Some of these orchard if temperatures are too low or conditions aren't right or they're too rainy. And we've certainly seen that over the last 60 days. And when you talk about these pollination windows, we might be talking about a 6-week time frame, and you kind of use it or lose it. So this is starting to become a concern, certainly, even though we maybe haven't had a huge and impactful hard freeze. We're starting to affect the bees, and there's a lot of them in California, and we rely on them and their pollination for production of a lot of these fruits and nut crops through the Central Valley. Something to keep in the back of your mind, unfortunately, as we move through spring here. The pattern I mentioned, we are kind of getting out of that transitional phase through the Pacific Ocean, the MJO. I showed that earlier. Potentially by the end of March, that returns to null space, or at least restarts far out in the Indian Ocean. When it does that, I would say that tends to reduce precipitation chances in California. We're talking about the end of March now, beginning of April. The new ECMWF weekly forecast came out just a few days ago. This is looking at their precipitation anomaly forecast from March 18th through April 18th. So the end of March, earlier part of April. You can see they've shifted drier for the Sierra Nevadas, shifted drier for Southern California, and perhaps wetter in parts of Northern California and some of these upper elevations here. At least a moderating signal in the sense that we're not seeing that same consistent wet signal for California. So a potential break in maybe some of these atmospheric river events or just the raininess and cool weather in general. Drier even through parts of western Oregon and Washington as well. We're seeing this in the ECMWF, the seasonal forecast, a little bit different of a forecast for April. Just looking at the whole month of April here, not a super strong signal in terms of dry outlook here, but not a wet signal by any means for California for the month of April. So we could be seeing something of a pattern shift as we get to the end of March and get into April. Taking a last look at the sea surface temperatures across the globe here, we've been talking about the potential in the forecast for La Nina to fade here in the spring of 2023, and I think we've just seen it. If we look here in our El Nino 3.4 box, we can see we've really lost that cool water signature through the central tropical Pacific, looking a little bit more scattered now, and really I think that's a result of a lot of westerly wind that has been blowing over this area anomalously over the last 14 days or so, and it's just really worked to warm up the temperatures here. I really wouldn't even necessarily call this a La Nina at this point, just kind of a pale or skeleton-like signature of what once was that 2021-2022 La Nina. In fact, the Climate Prediction Center will release their March 9th update on INSO tomorrow, and I would expect them to officially bring us out of La Nina status with that update tomorrow. We will see about that. On the last slide, we talked about those westerly wind bursts over the Pacific Ocean, how those are weakening La Nina. I think we can see that here, looking at this Hav-Mueller diagram across the Pacific Ocean, a rectangle, this area of interest here. Again, how to read these graphs, this middle black line here, March 8th, that's where we're at now. As we go up in the graph, that's back in time. As we go down in the graph, that's that forecast out through March. February up here, March down here. And we're looking at this area of the globe out in the Pacific Ocean here around the tropics. These red colors here, those are those westerly wind bursts we talked about. They've been occurring really over the last few days since we begun March. And they're expected to continue as we go through March, maybe moderating a bit at the end of March here. Those have helped to weaken La Nina. That's why we're expecting that status to be removed very soon. And while I see these westerly wind bursts, I see something else of interest here. If we look over toward Indonesia, or even out in the Indian Ocean, we see easterly wind anomalies. So this is where we have these trade winds blowing into the Indian Ocean or from the east to the west, and then in close proximity, we have trade winds blowing from the west to the east. That's creating divergence in between. The atmosphere is being evacuated or stretched out in between those winds moving from the east to the west and the winds in close proximity moving to the west to the east. The upper levels of the atmosphere will attempt to fill in that evacuated area, that relative low pressure in the lower levels of the atmosphere, that low here. And we will tend to have sinking air in that in-between area over the Indonesia, over the maritime continent, as we call it. Sinking air in terms of weather in the upper levels of the atmosphere tends to be boring weather at the surface. We tend to have warm air or warm conditions at the surface, clear weather, fairer weather. The atmosphere in nature doesn't like imbalances. So where we have the sinking air over Indonesia, we tend to have rising motion over the Pacific. And rising motion tends to be connected with the MJO. And we've seen over the last 5 days through the next 10, this transition, like we talked about, of the MJO moving from the western Pacific through the central, through the eastern Pacific into the western hemisphere. And I think we can see that if we jump over to a different Hobmuller diagram, looking at the 200 millibar velocity potential. That's just a crazy a term for looking at where that air is rising or sinking in the upper levels of the atmosphere. This brown color here, and I know it's not the most color friendly, but this brown color here looking at where air is sinking in the upper levels of the atmosphere, right over where we talked about, right over Indonesia. We talked about how it would be rising in the Pacific. Over the last few days, that rising motion has transitioned from the western Pacific through the central, through the eastern Pacific into the western hemisphere over the next few days. There's that transitioning La Nina we talked about, promoting the development of that extended Pacific jet stream. And we just talked about how that extended Pacific jet stream is connected to those atmospheric river events that are now in the forecast for California. So it's kind of this rare instance where the whole picture can be painted and connected together to the weather we're expecting just over the next 48 hours. It's neat when the atmosphere telegraphs itself in this way and paints this picture so clearly to us. We also see that the MJO might be trying at the end of March to reset itself back over in Indonesia and restart its march through Indonesia, through the maritime continent, through the Pacific, all over again over the next 60 days. That's the typical MJO behavior we see in maybe an INSO-neutral or an El Nino type base state. And we're moving into that, right, as we get out of La Nina. And so if we are going to see the MJO reset itself back over in the Indian Ocean, that would likely pause or give us a break in this wetter, snowier pattern in California as we end the month of March. Again, low confidence, we're talking 3 to 4 weeks out. But at least right now, looking at this picture, I at least see this signal that we'll see these events, right, over the next 5 to 6 days. We have that risk through the 3rd week of March, but potentially as we end the month and we get into April, we could see a break, and we're seeing some signal of that in those long-term forecasts. Maybe a bit of a dry signal in April, at the very least, not a wet signal. So connecting all these things together here. Big picture, looking at El Nino and the La Nina forecast as we go through 2023. Again, La Nina probability is extremely low. We're expected to be removed from that La Nina tomorrow, potentially, as early as Thursday, March 9th. INSO-neutral becomes the dominant probability, very likely, obviously, as we go through the next few months. But if you look at the right side of this graph, those red bars there, that's the El Nino probabilities we've been talking about, creeping up to end the year of 2023, to the point where they're really the most likely outcome. Now, that forecast probability is really only about 60 to 65%. That's not a slam dunk or a home run in terms of a forecast. But again, it is the dominant probability to close out 2023. If we're in an El Nino through the next water year, 23 and 24, that would tend to promote a wetter water year in California and Arizona. That's a number of months away, next winter, the start of the next water year, but that is where the forecast's out right now. In terms of probabilities, we'll be watching those ocean temperatures closely as we go through the end of spring and into summer. Longer video here this evening. Thank you all for making it to the end if you made it this far. We certainly advise you to heed the advice of local authorities in terms of flooding impacts, mudslides, and other inclement weather over the next 48 hours and into the next week. That being said, thank you for watching.